Hey, we are really glad you're here this morning. As I said, as I saw things sort of unfolding, the songs that Steve chose for our worship, what Abby said to start the service, what I knew was happening with prison ministry and Fresh Coast Alliance. Wow, God, you are in control of this. Do not let me mess it up. That is sincerely what I've been praying. And the question, how do you wrap up a series like this, 6 messages that are talking about digging deeper into giving the scriptural basis and some practical applications for our new vision statement? And you're probably, maybe some of you like I was initially, thinking, how can you take 3 simple statements and make them last for 6 messages, right? But the statement, uniting in Jesus, growing in Him, showing His love, there's a lot of depth to that. And so in staff meeting this past Monday, after Justin preached the first message on showing His love, Justin McFarlane here, Justin Staple at the Marquette campus, in staff meeting I said, okay, so guys, what else needs to be said about showing His love? And some of the things that we talked about were this, that we should talk about the gospel. What is the good news? What is the story that we have to tell about God and His love for the humanity that He created, the brokenness that drove us away, and what Jesus did that brings us back? They said, let's remind them of the great commandments, where God said, Jesus said, you can take and summarize all of what God said in the Old Testament laws into 2 simple statements. Love God with all that you are and all that you have, and love your neighbor as yourself. It came up that we should remind you of the Great Commission, that's the pattern that Jesus gave His followers for spreading this good news gospel, that we start with those that are closest to us, and then we take it to the next level of relationships out from there, and the next level, and finally to people that we don't even know through things that we call missions, until the whole world knows the good news about Jesus. And then we talked about how maybe this was the message where we should take all the parts of the vision statement and show how they create this continuum, right? A continuum, a cycle where we start with our only basis, our only foundation, which is Jesus, and us being all in on Him and united in that belief that Jesus is the rescue solution for the world, and that we grow in Him, we just stay grounded and founded in Him. That causes us to grow in our spiritual life to the point where we can't help but catch the parts of the Bible where it talks again and again and again about reaching the people that don't yet know this Jesus, and how we reach them effectively by showing them that not only does God love them, but there are people that don't even necessarily know them all that well that care about them and love them as well. And then Matthew 25, that Abby read this morning, came up, and how there is this importance of showing people that the church has to be doing practical, loving things like sheltering the homeless and feeding the hungry and giving something to drink to the thirsty and visiting those that are sick and in prison. All of those are right, and they are good, and they are a necessary part of what we're talking about. But the thing that I could not shake this week, the thing that I kept coming back to over and over again, was how Jesus did this Himself. How Jesus did this. Because if you are here today and you call yourself a Christian, that means you are a Christ follower. The actual phrase in the New Testament era meant little Christs. Now I know we don't talk like that because that would sound blasphemous, right? But Christians, little Christs, and we're trying to look like Him and think like Him and act like Him and love people like He would love them. And so I wanted to dig into that. When God became a human being, when God the Son took on the form that we know as Jesus the Christ, what did that look like? I don't mean the artist's idea of what that looked like. I mean, what did that look like in a practical sense? How did He act? How did He spend His time? With whom did He spend His time? What were His priorities? And I think we would agree that one of the things that we see in Jesus' life, not that He didn't have the times when He spoke strongly about different issues, especially to religious people, yikes, but how did Jesus show love? to the people that he wanted to believe that he was God come in human flesh, and the only way that they could be saved and brought into right relationship with God. Just a couple of things that I thought of. First of all, really look at the amount of time that Jesus spent with people. Spending time with people conveys this idea that they have a value to you. They are valuable enough that you will minimize some of your very important TV time in order to spend time with them. And I know that sounds silly, but we are all pretty protective about our time and how and where we spend it. And when you spend it with people, those people feel valued by that. They feel honored by that. In Jesus' life, you look at it, and Jesus had an incredibly busy, pressure-filled life. From before the sun came up until after the sun came down, the gospel accounts are very clear. He was spending time with, investing in his disciples, investing in sick people, struggling people, hungry people, multitudes, larger groups, smaller groups. He just spent time with people. And knowing that was going to be his day, he got up even earlier than that to spend time with the Father and stayed up after the multitudes were dismissed to spend time with the Father. But he spent time with people. I love that Jesus was amazing at asking questions. Now think about this. Jesus, as God in a human body, he knew everything. God knows everything. There are no surprises to God. So if I knew everything, if I had created everything, and if I knew everything, why on earth would I ever walk up to you and ask you a question I already know the answer to? The reason Jesus walked up to people, engaged them in conversation, and asked them amazing questions was because he knew that giving people an opportunity to say who they were and what they were going through and what their struggles were, what their concerns were, was a way to engage them in a meaningful conversation. And so he was a great question asker. We need to do better at that. He showed compassion for practical needs. As I already mentioned, he fed the hungry. He healed the sick. And we know it's pretty clear from the gospel accounts that sometimes before teaching a multitude, he would look at them and realize that there was hunger issues. And so he would say, got to feed these people first. And they did not all have pure motivations. It became clear after a while that sometimes the crowds were following him because they enjoyed yesterday's lunch and they wanted today's lunch. Okay, so human nature is human nature, but Jesus said, I have compassion for these people. He showed sympathy for the grieving. One of my favorite gospel stories is Jesus and his friendship with Lazarus and Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary. And when Lazarus died, knowing that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, he still went to the area where the family was grieving, and he spent time with Martha, and then he spent time with Mary first. He had sympathy for the grieving. He intentionally went to the marginalized. He intentionally went to those that society had said, that's enough of that garbage. We're done with you. For example, the Samaritan woman that Jesus intentionally took a different route to get to where she was, the village where she was, so that he could have a conversation with her. That was not by chance. That was set up by Jesus because he went to the marginalized. And he showed acceptance to sinners. Think about that. Because this is one of the things that the church has always wrestled with, that the church is wrestling with today. What do you do about the fact that people are struggling? More than that they are sinful, sometimes blatantly and willfully sinful. What do we do about that? Well, we can't really show them acceptance, so sometimes, whether we intend to or not, the message is this. You clean up your act, and then we would love to have you at our church. But if you've got this issue going on in your life, you probably should stay away until you deal with that issue, then come and let us love you. And it doesn't really work. And so that's where I want us to go today. Not because it's new. Not that the territory we're going to cover today is new territory. In fact, I think it's incredibly familiar territory, unless you have not been around the church much until the last number of weeks or months. or a brand new baby Christian, you probably know what we're going to talk about. But it's so powerful what happens in Luke chapter 15 that I would say there are probably 3 reactions here. As I read what I'm going to read in Luke chapter 15, one of the reactions from some of you here is going to be just kind of an overall sense of numbness. Like, I've heard that before, I've heard that before, are you going to tell me that again? Just numb to it. It doesn't amaze you anymore because you've heard it and not done anything with it. That's how numbness, quite honestly, happens. The second group, and this is the best and most hopeful group, I think, are the people who maybe you've heard it many, many times, but you're still going to be amazed again today when you see this passage. And the third group are going to be those who maybe are newer in your faith. You've not heard this a lot, and you're going to hear what we read, and you're going to go, really? You're going to be surprised. In fact, I put it this way. It's going to be head-scratching for you. Luke 15 contains head-scratching truth that maybe is almost too shocking to wrap your head and heart around. But here we go. Here's how Luke 15 starts. Just the first 2 verses. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. Now, I'd like you to wait right there and let that sentence sort of wash over you and let it sink in. I laugh at the fact that it says tax collectors and other notorious sinners, because I have to ask, what is so awful about tax collectors that they not only get called out by name, but then get lumped in with notorious sinners? And I think it's because in Jesus' day, if you were a tax collector, you were identifying with the Roman Empire in a very clear way. You were collecting taxes that a godless, or actually polytheistic, Roman Empire wanted from your people, your nation, you. So you were abusing your own people and were also a dirty, rotten scoundrel. So it's like you're twice dirty. But tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. This was a common practice. This was something that happened frequently. And so, seeing this happen again and again and again, here's what happens. This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. And I underlined often for one reason, we already touched on that. And eating with them, I underlined because I want to dig into that a little bit deeper in just a minute. But here's a couple of things that I think are noteworthy. First of all, people wanted to and enjoyed spending time with Jesus. Outsiders, people who felt spiritually disconnected, people who felt spiritually disenfranchised, wanted to and enjoyed spending time with Jesus. Why? Again, sometimes our attitude is, well, the reason that the world or society doesn't like me is because I believe the truth and they believe a lie. Okay? I think we don't get along because I point out the error of their ways and they just don't want to hear it. Yeah, probably true. But think about the way that comes across. Think about how it comes across. Does it come across in a condemning, judging way? Does it come out in a natural sort of way because we have relationship with those people? You know, it's amazing what you can say to someone, how honest you can be with someone that you have a true, genuine relationship with. Any of us that has any depth and health to our marriage at all knows that depth and that health comes from us being able to talk honestly and graciously about the hard stuff, the difficult stuff. And so to be able to spend time with Jesus and enjoy it, and to have Jesus obviously enjoy it too, says a lot about the way Jesus approached these people. Jesus showed full acceptance to them as, this is critical, as God loved but sin damaged humans. And what I'm trying to convey there is this idea that Jesus was much better than we are sometimes at saying, yes, that's wrong. You're wrong, but I still care about you. I still love you. I still want to redeem you. There is value that I want to bring back into your relationship with God. He didn't deny the fact that they were messed up. He didn't deny the fact that they were broken. In fact, if you remember, when Zacchaeus came to faith in Jesus, Jesus was the one who announced that Zacchaeus had seen the error of his ways, that he realized he was wrong. He was one of those notorious dirty sinner tax collectors. I mean, he was doubly bad. And yet, relationship with Jesus brought him into truth and into forgiveness. And this is the point I wanted to dwell on just a little bit, that he ate with them, which in that day, in that culture, was a sign of true relationship. Now, this is true with us to a degree as well. We understand that if you are going to sit down with someone and have coffee with them or invite them out and sit and have lunch with them, that the goal is that you can have a little bit more in-depth conversation with them. But in the first century Mediterranean, Roman-dominated culture, this relationship, this acceptance that came with eating a meal with someone went to a whole nother level. So here's how we think about eating in our culture. Actually, I seriously thought this morning about finding a picture of a family with food sitting on a couch looking at a TV set. But instead, I chose this more traditional view. And notice at this table, you don't probably put a tablecloth on your table every week or every night or anything like that. But everyone has their own plate, their own utensils with which to eat their food. They have their own drinking glass, and then there are these common bowls and plates with servingware. And you know what good etiquette is at a meal like this? You don't touch other people's stuff. You don't use their spoon to feed your face. You don't take the serving spoon and put stuff on your plate and then take your finger and scrape the serving spoon off. I don't care how good that stuffing is, don't do it. So we know what proper etiquette is, but here is the completely different sense of a meal and what it meant to have relational fellowship in the first century. And believe it or not, I had a real hard time finding pictures of meals in the first century for some reason. Think about that. So this is a picture of how meals were actually eaten. And you'll notice that there are common bowls, but there are no utensils. And the top picture has something I can't tell. I guess it looks like little plates and so on. But no servingware in the bowls at all. In a meal like that, you would actually have to use your hand or a piece of bread to dig what you wanted out of the common serving bowl. And so this meal that Jesus was having with tax collectors and notorious sinners, it was a meal where bodies would be touching. If you've ever been with somebody recently at a meal and your foot touches their foot under the table, what do? Apologize, right? I'm sorry about that. Did my foot touch your foot? I'm really sorry. Okay. This is bodies touching. This is people laying on their sides and them being side by side. The picture that I want you to remember is where Jesus was having his Last Supper with his disciples, and the disciple that he loved, John the Beloved, was actually laying so close to Jesus that all he did is lean his head back and talk to Jesus in his face and say, "Who's going to betray you?" And what did Jesus say? Jesus said, "The person that I will dip my hand in the bowl with, that's the person who's going to betray me." I mean, so we've got bodies touching, we've got common bowls with hands going in, multiple hands sometimes at the same time, and you definitely have this going on. You definitely have double dipping going on. I mean, come on. That hand is going in, your hand was just there, that bread is going in, your bread was just there. You took your bread, you took a bite, then you dip in again. And so there's this real sharing of space And that's why meals demonstrated true relational acceptance. Folks, hear me. Jesus was showing those sinful people true relational acceptance. And they had not changed yet. And so it's no wonder that the very religious people were freaking out, right? I mean, think about it. Their attitude, what they're thinking, what they're wondering is not that far off from what we think and wonder in circumstances where our lives are encountering the lives of messed up people, of intentionally and willfully sinful people. Our lives intersect, and what do? So the religious people are looking at Jesus doing that, all of that contact with sinful people, and they're wondering, doesn't Jesus realize that these people are the problem? Now, I guess humanity's brokenness, humanity's sinfulness has always been society's problem, right? Because if we were all completely aligned with God's will and God's word, and our heart belonged to Him completely and so on, and we were striving for obedience, there'd be a whole lot less societal brokenness, mess. But this is even going further than that, because if you were a Pharisee or you were an expert in the law in Jesus' day, here's what they gleaned. Here's what they believed from the Old Testament. They believed that God had set a standard, and the standard was this: all of you obey my laws and obey my commands, and when the whole nation of you is adhering to my laws and commands, I will send my Messiah, and he will usher Israel into worldwide prominence and greatness again. So obey me and my laws, and I will send the Messiah, and he will be the great leader of a new world order. So they were kind of looking for the Messiah, but part of the reason why they couldn't imagine that it was Jesus is because there were still so many sinful, awful people around them, and this guy who claimed that he was the Messiah was hanging out with them. This is ridiculous, folks. These people that Jesus were hanging out with, they thought were the problem because they were not getting on the Pharisee and teachers of the law bandwagon, which is do better, try harder. Do better, try harder. Do better, try harder. Keep more laws, keep more commands until God sends his Messiah to thank us for being such good rule keepers. Instead, Jesus comes into the world and he says, I've come to seek and to save that which is lost. I've come specifically for the broken and messed up people. And by the way, again, a question that we ask, doesn't his acceptance of them in the state that they are in, still collecting taxes, still doing who knows what that makes them notorious sinners, doesn't that mean he condones their lifestyle? And if he condones their lifestyle, why would they ever come to see their need for repentance and salvation? And so we ask the same question. You know, if we as a church welcome folks to come in and experience what goes on here, let's just say on a Sunday morning, although that should never be our, come and see what we do on Sunday morning. There's a lot of other, smaller, closer to the ground ministries where people could take a peek and plug in and so on. But if they come here, if you say, come here and see what's going on in our services, hear what we talk about, hear how important Jesus is to us. But they can only get that invitation if they've already cleaned up some significant area of messiness that you know exists in their life. How are they ever going to come? You, sexually immoral person, if you stop being sexually immoral, I could bring you to church. I know we don't really, well, maybe sometimes we do kind of think that way. That's not what Jesus was all about. He showed them acceptance. He entered into relationship with them and used that as an opportunity to tell them what God had to say about them, about God's love and how God's love could change the refuge or the place where they were trying to hide to find relief. And doesn't that close contact that he's having with them contaminate Jesus' holiness? What if I'm the person who is seen having coffee with unsaved people, lunch with unsaved people? I'm hanging out and socializing with unsaved people. They're inviting me to their parties, and I'm going. Doesn't that look bad for me? Doesn't that contaminate me? Jesus didn't view it that way. And you know, the Pharisees and the experts in the law had a whole different level of expectation when it came to this, because in their mindset, if you touched something after you had ceremonially washed for a meal or a festival or a banquet, once you touched something or someone that was unclean, you were unclean again. So they really literally believed that touching that bowl or that hand of that sinful person made him unholy, contaminated him. And it is in response to all of this that Jesus tells three parables that we're just going to read and apply very quickly here. You know these very well. First, the parable of the lost sheep. So Jesus told them, the Pharisees and the religious leaders, this story. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go to search for the one that's lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. When he arrives, he will call together his friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me." I urge you to pay careful attention to what I've underlined. Not that it's more important than what I didn't underline, but because it draws out a point I'm going to make. Rejoice with me because I have found my lost sheep. In the same way, there is more joy in heaven over one lost sinner who repents and returns to God than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't strayed. So the lost sheep, then next, the lost coin. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Won't she light a lamp and sweep the entire house and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she will call in her friends and neighbors and say, "Rejoice with me because I found a coin." Okay, come over and I'm throwing a party tonight. Why? Because I found a penny. Okay, a dime, silver coin. Rejoice with me because I have found my lost coin. In the same way, there is joy in the presence of God's angels when even one sinner repents. And then he follows immediately with probably the best known parable that Jesus ever told, the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son we call it. To illustrate the point further, because religious people are slow to get what's being said to them, apparently. Jesus told them this story. A man had two sons. The younger son told his father, "I want my share of your estate now, before you die." So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, his younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time the money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. But no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, "At home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant.' So, after coming up with his appeal, he returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, and filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son.' But his father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead, but has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found.' So the party began." Wow. So what do I want you to notice from these parables? First of all, and this is really important, two things I'm about to say that are really important. Here's the first one. Jesus, I believe, absolutely purposely avoids giving any details of how the lost got lost. There are not details. Even when it comes to the most detailed of the parables, the parable of the prodigal son or the lost son, we assign motives. We try to find insights into what was going on in this relationship and why did he leave and what was he thinking and so on. Jesus doesn't do that because he decided. And dad said, okay, and he left. So in the case of the sheep's wandering, we don't know why or how the sheep wandered away. In the case of the coin, we don't know if it was the owner's carelessness or if something else happened, but we don't know. It's just, it was lost, it must be found. It's lost, it must be found. In the case of the lost son's ultimate motivations, again, we don't know. He's gone. He needs to be restored. That's the heart of this. And the ultimate goal, it's obvious, is none lost. None lost. No lost sheep, no lost coins, no lost children. That's the goal. That's the heart. You see, we understand that the sheep and the coins and the children simply are three ways that Jesus is saying God cares about the things that are lost. And you can relate to that because you know what it's like to have something lost. You know what it's like to have a friend or a child or a spouse or someone who is far away from you and you're concerned about them. And I want you to know that God cares about them in that circumstance as well. I underlined this recurring theme in every parable. Rejoice with me. Rejoice with me. Because God is showing us his heart. God's heart is, rejoice with me. My lost sheep has been found. Rejoice with me. The lost coin has been found. Rejoice with me. The son who wandered away has been found and is restored. Rejoice with me. I think sometimes that we believe that the heart of God is, I guess, basically to see people made right. Right, lining up with laws, lining up with rules. And there is a place for that. John, for example, is very clear. You don't say, I know God and love God, and then ignore what he says. You don't do that. But we put keeping of rules and keeping our lifestyle in order to such a high degree that sometimes we forget that God is about relationship. And we come and we sing songs and we worship together. I love that we have a heart for worship. We should always have a heart for worship. That's not what pleases the heart of God the most. We open his word, we preach the word, we teach it in classes, we read it personally, devotionally, individually. That's awesome. That's not what blesses the heart of God most. We give offerings, we serve in ministries, we serve outside of the walls of our church. Those are good and important things. That's not what blesses the heart of God the most. What blesses the heart of God the most is when the lost one is found. And all of heaven erupts in a celebration because a wandering one is home again. I don't want to belabor this, but I just put in your outline that we tend to focus on outreach for growth sometimes when God emphasizes seeking to restore. After the first service, I had somebody come up and very respectfully push back on this. And he said, I don't really think this is fair because when people are found and restored, we should see them attending, becoming a part of the church. I said, I absolutely agree. But here's what happens to me as a pastor sometimes. If I invest in that person's life and I come alongside them and I'm their friend and I share spiritual truth and they end up coming to know Jesus Christ as their Savior, I want and kind of expect them to be a part of my church. I want their transformation to translate into my church's growth. And God says, you know what, that's not the point at all. I'm just trying to restore, seek, find, save, forgive, transform the lost ones. So we need to adjust our mindset a little bit. This vision statement is huge. It's small, it's simple, but it's huge. It is too big for us to do on our own. It is too great, it is too difficult, it is too complex for us to do it on our own. And as we go into this time of sharing the bread and the cup of communion, I want us to remember the dependence that we have on God and his Spirit. That it is him working in our lives. that brings us to Jesus in the first place, that causes us to grow in the second place, and that gives us a passion for reaching out in the third place so that others can know and unite in Jesus. Let me pray as the worship team comes. We're going to sing, and then we're going to share the bread and the cup together.